Sam Lyman, thanks for coming on the podcast. Really appreciate you being here. For those who don't know, Sam recently joined the Bitcoin Policy Institute. He was a senior advisor to Treasury Secretary Bessent. Beforehand, I think you were at Riot Platforms, which is like a Bitcoin and AI mining and infrastructure company doing a lot of great work. So Sam has a lot of background in the space that I want to bring him on to talk about, and specifically the Bitcoin Policy Institute. And Sam is the head of research. Just posted a white paper about Chinese influence, Chinese state influence, specifically in the campaign against American AI. A lot of it having to do with data centers and just technological innovation. So Sam, really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, Jordan, great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, for sure. So what kind of so I know that there were a lot of insights in this white paper, and I'll definitely link to it in the show notes. What inspired you to start taking a look at the potential connections between Chinese state institutions and this, great AI race between the U.S. and China?
Yeah, a couple things. One is previous experience. So, Jordan, as you mentioned at the top, I worked at Riot Platforms a couple years ago. And when I was there, we were building a data center in Corsicana, Texas. It's a small rural town in Texas. Great people, beautiful place. It's a population of about 25,000 people. And we were building a 1 gigawatt data center, and we were investing in the community. We were donating to schools and to charities out there and creating jobs. We created about 150 jobs in that area alone just through that data center. Even so, we saw significant resistance from the citizens of Corsicana. And we dug deeper on why that resistance was there and where it was coming from. And we were able to pinpoint one individual in particular who wasn't even a resident of the town. She lived in the town next to it. And she was working with outside organizations in order to gin up a lot of controversy and spread a lot of misinformation about the data center we were building. So there's the old adage, follow the money. We followed the money as to who she could be partnering with and where that funding might come from. And we were able to actually trace some of that money trail back to Greenpeace. And we were able to trace Greenpeace's donations back to XRP Ripple at the time, which is those who might be somewhat familiar with the cryptocurrency ecosystem. Ripple, or XRP, its cryptocurrency, is somewhat of a rival with Bitcoin. And so we were able to see that there were other motivations at play. And even though this particular activist didn't seem to care that much about cryptocurrency whatsoever, she just had an axe to grind on the environmental front. We recognized that there were certain donors that were pushing her quote unquote grassroots movement to oppose our data center. And so from that experience, I was able to look at the situation we're facing now nationally, where there seems to be opposition to data centers, not just in rural Texas, but all across the country. And it seems to be coming out of nowhere. And the flames seem to be fanned significantly on social media. And so just using the intuition from my previous experience, I figured that we would follow the money and follow the information and trace out who exactly is pushing a lot of the misinformation that's out there, who might be donating to these organizations that are sponsoring misinformation, and what could be done about that.
Appreciate the rundown. So China, it seems, really has a strategic priority in slowing down American innovation. And while there are protesters, I think with legitimate grievances, especially people that are, I don't want to say everyone is misinformed, but there's a lot of people that are just like generally have this like anti-innovation sentiment. And then when that's coupled with the fuel on the fire that's being promoted by these outside forces, and your institution has done a great job mapping this out. Do you want to talk about specifically? I'm fascinated by like this group of outside wealthy individuals, specifically Singham, who lives in Shanghai now, who shares office space with the Communist Party of China, and funds, like these like far left radical organizations. Have you tracked any of these organizations participating in this AI data center debate?
Yeah, let's zoom in particular on the network that you just mentioned, Jordan, the Singham network. There's that scene in the first Star Wars where Obi-Wan Kenobi walks into the Mos Eisley Cantina and he says, "You will never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy." That, as far as the nonprofit world goes, that's how I would describe the Singham Network. It's essentially a coalition of CCP aligned nonprofits based here in the United States that's funded by one particular individual, Neville Singham, who is a self identified socialist who, like you said, lives in Shanghai. He's a former Huawei consultant, and he's been beating the drum for the Chinese Communist Party for the past several years. So, what we were able to trace in our report is how exactly his coalition is working directly with China's state media to push anti-data center and anti-export control language here in the United States. You have the co-founder of Code Pink, for example, openly collaborating with China state propaganda. You have the director of Tricontinental, another nonprofit in the Singham Network, who does exclusive Q&As with China state media. And you have them parroting the exact same talking points coming directly from the CCP and essentially translating those talking points for an English-speaking audience here in the United States. So in our report, we were able to trace exactly how they're collaborating with China state media, how they're echoing their exact same talking points, and how they're amplifying Chinese messaging when it comes to data centers and when it comes to export controls. What's interesting about this particular organization is that this individual, Neville Singham, has faced several inquiries from the House of Representatives looking deeper into his CCP ties. And it's really not a partisan judgment to see that he is clearly working closely with the PRC, or appears to be working closely with the PRC in some capacity. The New York Times actually ran a blockbuster report in 2023 that documented extensively all of his ties to the People's Republic of China and to their government leaders over there. So it's something that has been going on behind the scenes, but just now people are starting to connect the dots with how the Singham Network in particular has been working really closely with China state media and creating this overall environment of fear here in the United States when it comes to data centers and AI.
I'm really glad that a lot of this information is coming out, because I think that public sentiment you see in polling, the propaganda campaign against AI data centers is working at an alarming rate. The majority of people when surveyed are hesitant or against the build out of data centers. And I think a lot of that is an education problem, but it's also, these activists and influencers with all kinds of like weird foreign connections, sowing maximum chaos. It reminds me a lot of, previous attempts to divide people. Code Pink, obviously always involved heavily in the anti-U.S. military, whatever the U.S. military is doing, they're opposed to it. Whatever, whoever's in charge of the U.S. government is, an imperialist, evil Nazi. And it just, then they, October 7th happens, and, Singham's rabble rousers come into the streets, to support Hamas. And it's like one thing after another. And it seems like he's just, his network is guided by, it seems they have like this ideological coalition, but the problem is that coalition kind of like creeps into Congress and the Senate. Bernie and AOC are teaming up on this high profile data center moratorium effort, or really government censorship effort. For all the talk that I see from these AI policy, AI data center dissidents about surveillance and the like, do you want to just like walk some people through exactly what Bernie and AOC are trying to do with the AI space in the U.S. with their legislation that they're crafting?
Yeah, that is really concerning what's happening with the moratorium bill that they introduced. So it also brings up the third vector of misinformation, which comes from foreign billionaires. So we've talked about China state media, the Singham Network. That's the third vector we identified is the foreign billionaire trail. There's two in particular. There's Alan Parker, whose son is Christian Parker, so the Parker family, and then Hans-Jörg Wyss. And Hans-Jörg Wyss is based in Switzerland. The Parker family is an English family. What they've done is they've essentially moved money through dark money groups here in the United States, as well as direct donations to nonprofits here in the US who are openly advocating for a slowdown in data center build out. A couple organizations, just to name a few, are Greenpeace, 350.org, New York Communities for Change. There's a lot of organizations out there that signed the moratorium letter that eventually led to the legislation that Bernie Sanders and AOC introduced. So to plot this out, you have the foreign billionaires donating to the nonprofits, and then the nonprofits are pushing a moratorium letter that was signed back in December. When that letter was released, there was 107 days only between the release of that letter and the introduction of Bernie Sanders and AOC's legislation, calling for a nationwide ban on all AI data center build out. So to put that into perspective for people listening, if you were a government operative in Beijing and you could cook up your own policy that would hamstring the United States in the AI race, you couldn't think of anything better than a data center moratorium. Nothing would slow down our AI build out more than making it explicitly illegal to build out data centers in the United States. It would be a catastrophic cell phone if the US government were to implement any policy like that. But we can see the train of influence very clearly from our research. It comes from those foreign billionaires and the way that they interact with the US nonprofit ecosystem and the power that those US nonprofits have to then move and shape legislation after that. We saw that play out perfectly with this data center moratorium that Bernie Sanders is pushing for.
Yeah, it's super alarming. And, they do have natural allies in tech through, I would say, like these kind of like effective altruist slash doomer organizations that are passionately committed to shutting down AI entirely because they think it's going to wipe out the human race. Is that Bitcoin policy's perspective on AI, or do you guys look at it a little differently?
Yeah, we think the AI safety question is a really complicated one, and that we need to have serious conversations about what safe AI looks like, but those conversations should in no way be influenced by a foreign adversary. And I think that's what you're seeing take place with Bernie Sanders' event, for example, when he invited 2 Chinese nationals to come and lecture US policymakers on what safe AI looks like. We are of the opinion that that conversation needs to be had, but it needs to be had by Americans amongst Americans without any foreign powers putting their thumbs on the scale of that conversation.
Yeah, that's really fair. In terms of the rolling back the anti-data center propaganda, what I'm seeing now is that, like, how do you deal with skeptics who bring up one? It seems that, like, no matter what, some people are just going to be opposed to technological progress because it's like this unknown thing. What's going to happen in the future? What is the job market going to look like, right? So they point to this data center issue and say, it's poisoning the water. Oh no, it's actually vacuuming up the water. Our electricity bills are going to go up. There's so much, there are some grievances that are legitimate, but I think, like, from what I'm reading, like 90% of it is just seemingly just as much propaganda as that can be thrown into this issue to kind of like muddy the waters and make it impossible to have a rational conversation. How do you deal with individuals and groups who are like wildly misinformed on this issue and just say, data centers bad. I don't want this World Economic Forum dictatorship surveillance Palantir, blah, 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 dominating my life. Get this data center out of my state. It's become like this like nuclear NIMBY issue. How do you deal like on the home front with the domestic conversation?
Yeah, I love the term nuclear NIMBYism. I think that well describes it. My answer to that is just relentless education. That's all we can do. And like you said, there's so much misinformation out there, especially on the energy usage issue and the water usage issue. I read recently that the water usage statistics that are being circulated on social media overestimate how much water data centers use by about 1,000x. So that's egregious. And that's the kind of misinformation that's being dispelled every single day from Instagram and TikTok and Twitter. They say that a lie can get halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to put its pants on. I think you're seeing that play out in real time right now with the AI data center debate. So for our part, the best thing we can do is just educate, to constantly dispel the myths that are out there and to differentiate the facts from the fiction. If there's one thing that makes me bullish, it goes back to that previous experience I had in Texas when I worked at Riot Platforms. There was so much misinformation out there, but we were able to clear up all of the misinformation. I was going out to Corsicana frequently to meet directly with the residents of the town, to meet with the leaders of the town, to directly address the falsehoods that were being propagated by these activist movements that really were astroturfed in the community. We were able to have a town hall with the residents. We were able to answer all of their questions and able to make the case that this data center that we're building will be a net good for the town. It will bring more jobs and more investment into the town, and there won't be any significant impact on the things that they're worried about, such as water and such as electricity. And so that was critical. And in time, we were able to get the town on our side and pass the legislation on the town level that we needed to in order to get that data center constructed. So that makes me hopeful that we can replicate that on a national scale too. There's a lot of misinformation out there, but the greatest antidote for misinformation is simply the truth, simply laying out the facts for people. And I think we'll be able to do that. It just might take some time, and we have to be aggressive in our advocacy and in our education efforts.
Yeah, it's interesting because like a lot of the benefits that the general public in the United States will receive, or even the world, from an AI data center build out is just simply having the ability for a more advanced, say, chatbot that you can interact with for another hour per day, right? So some of the benefits tend not to be specifically local, but what I find fascinating is that these the critics won't really acknowledge the massive boon that it's been for the construction industry first and foremost, and also that they pay an enormous amount of taxes to whatever the local city is or the county is. And yes, I think that a lot of states and in local areas are bringing them in with sweetheart deals, offering some land up basically for free. But when these operations get rolling, and I'm sure like you've seen the numbers, the taxes that these counties specifically are getting from these data centers it's it has a potential for revolutionary change for like say like emergency services, police, fire, your parks, and even I was just like kind of talking about this on X the other day that like some politicians that are pro AI should start thinking about this issue about supporting data centers because like nobody wants to pay a lot in taxes, but there's so many benefits to your area receiving a massive amount of tax revenue. And in the state of Florida, a lot of our politicians are trying to lower or get rid of property taxes entirely. And I think that this AI era can result in like a real fundamental change in our tax paying relationship with the government if you have like these hyperscalers coming in. Do you think that they could potentially kind of like essentially subsidize the locals to provide like more local benefit, maybe lower their taxes overall because they're providing so much tax revenue to the area?
Yeah, I'd have to see the math on that, but I think they could to a significant extent. I know that in some rural towns, there's one in particular in Utah that I read about recently. The data center being built out there stands to triple the tax revenue that the county was receiving beforehand. So that just shows you how much of an impact these data centers can make on a financial level. If you have a data center that's going to triple the tax revenue, then just like you're describing, Jordan, you could effectively phase out any income taxes from that county if there are income taxes from a county level. So I definitely see that there's a possibility of doing that. And who knows what that would look like nationally, but I think it's a conversation that's definitely worth having. I think people need to realize what is truth and what is false about the current narrative around data centers and the potential benefits that data centers can bring to their lives, not only from AI, but like you're saying, the potential benefits in maybe reducing some of the tax burden or maybe eliminating it altogether. That'd be incredible if that's feasible. So definitely a conversation worth having.
Yeah, I think when we enter this new era of the unknown, it's worth also to kind of counter these doomer narratives to talk about the potential positive implications of AI and how the distribution of talent, it's going to be more. I think it's going to be more accessible than ever for someone who doesn't have a lot going for them to start a business and become very successful, out of wherever they live in America, whether that's in a super rural area or in super urban area. And I wanted to pivot a little bit to this global AI race, and it seems that the U.S. and China are really, you know, by far, there's really only two competitors in terms of like whose system is going to emerge. Europe is such like a hyper regulatory environment, and I'd say like a cautionary tale for what America could become if we, give in to the AOC Bernie legislation. Um, so what is it? What do you see like the distinction between the two systems? Like how China is building out AI, what it wants to use AI as a tool for, what the CCP hopes to accomplish with AI versus the American system. Like why is it so important that the U.S. Effectively, outpaces China on this front?
Jordan, that's such an important question because we've heard so often as people who are in favor of AI, the response to any criticism that we need to beat China in the AI race. So people who are maybe impartial about AI, they hear we need to beat China over and over. And as AI supporters, those Americans don't really understand what we mean when we say we need to beat China. They don't understand the stakes, and that's on us. It's on us to communicate to them exactly what are the stakes in the AI race and to lay it out very clearly. The stakes are enormous because who controls the AI economy? Essentially, it controls the information economy of the entire world. And you could not have two different information environments than the United States of America and the Chinese Communist Party. Just to contrast those two, the United States was founded on the principle of freedom of expression and individual liberty. And the CCP cares nothing for either one of those things. The CCP is a notoriously closed system, so much so that they erected a great firewall in order to censor information that could come through the internet to their people. And so China has a vested interest in owning the information economy in the future. And they'll succeed in that effort if they win the AI race. So who wins the AI race will simply determine the kind of information that our children and grandchildren have access to. China is playing this game really smart. Their strategy is remarkably different than the United States. Ironically enough, they're pursuing an open source strategy where the models that they're pushing globally are open weight models. And the idea behind that is that it's easier for companies and individuals across the world to adopt an AI model that they don't have to pay for. Whereas here in the United States, we're definitely leading China right now in the AI race because we have the frontier AI companies. However, you have to pay subscriptions for those AI models, whether it's $20 a month for OpenAI or $200 a month for Claude. A lot of these rates are prohibitive for people in developing countries, for example. So what China is doing is they're diffusing their models globally, and in so doing, they're diffusing their control over the information economy globally. Whereas here in the United States, we're really pushing the boundaries on what are the best AI models. But again, this is why it's so critical that we ultimately win this race, that we beat out China, because we want the world to have access to open information. We want the world to be able to use AI models that will tell the truth about the CCP. That's what's so remarkable about the way China is training its AI models. Even though it's an open source model, the information they're using to train their models on is anything but. The information that they're using is deliberately censored. It's removes any criticism of the CCP. So for example, if you were to ask DeepSeek, hot off the presses after it's been trained, what happened in Tiananmen Square in 1989, it wouldn't really be able to respond to you because it's part of the censorship that the CCP has introduced into the training process. So it is critical for the future of free expression that the United States win the AI race. Those are the stakes, and that's what we're not communicating well enough, I think, to a lot of people who might have concerns about AI, something as an industry and as a community that we could do a better job at.
100% agree. And in terms of connecting that to like the data centers, um, why is it like I think just from like a first principles like very rudimentary perspective, why do we need to build data centers, for those who aren't aware, why do we need to build data centers to compete with China on AI? What would you say to the critic who says, we already have so many data centers, why don't you just use those data centers? Why is it so important to engage in this data center build out?
I would say that the AI data centers are like the enriched uranium of this race. If I were to compare it to the Manhattan Project, for example, these data centers are absolutely critical for both training the AI models and for inference. In other words, for providing the compute that AI needs to be able to answer the questions that we ask. It is essential that we do so, especially because China has a leg up on the United States in terms of electricity generation. That is one area where China is particularly strong. And when China wants to build out a new power plant, be it a nuclear power plant or coal-powered power plant, there's no protesters that are stopping them from doing that. The Chinese state just acts unilaterally without any protest whatsoever. Whereas here in the United States, it's difficult. We need to, because we're a democracy, we need to secure the buy-in of the people. And that's critically important because we need to have all voices heard in this debate. We just need to make sure that those voices aren't being swayed by China because China has a vested interest in ensuring that we don't build more data centers. But that's how I would describe it. Data centers are sort of the enriched uranium of this race. That's why it's critical that we build them out because the stakes couldn't be higher than they are right now.
Mm-hmm. The caveat is, of course, that it's enriched uranium, but it's not going to turn into a nuclear weapon that can be used against us.
Important distinction.
If you recall, again, in the AI policy world, there's this very interesting debate about, the ramifications of the advancement of AI. But it certainly seems that there's so much demand for AI compute. I'm sure you read the report about, in SpaceX's formal filing to go public, they showed that Anthropic is paying them over $1 billion a month just to lease space to run compute. So it's crazy, how lucrative the data center space has become, but the insane demand. It seems like we have a lot of catching up to do, right? Like if Anthropic is paying that much money to basically pay for the entire cost of the data center in like a year and a half, doesn't that mean that like we have a lot of building to do for kind of like the market to catch up on this mechanism?
Yeah, as the market clearly indicates right now, we can't seem to build fast enough. And it's important that we have the ability to build out because if we don't, again, China will leapfrog us in this race. They face hardly any obstacles to building out data centers. Where they face obstacles, though, is on the compute end because of the export controls that we've imposed on it. As far as data center construction, they're not facing any obstacles in China. All the obstacles are being faced here in the United States, in large part, too, because our grid is outdated. And I think nationally and also on a state and local level, we have not taken care of the grid in the way that we have needed to over the last couple of decades. And now it's coming back to bite us. And it's something that we need to really address as a country.
Appreciate it. Yeah, last couple minutes, since you're working for the Bitcoin Policy Institute, let's talk about Bitcoin for a little. What's your theory on the price action in Bitcoin and why there seems to be kind of it's a very strange cycle, Bitcoin hovering around 77, 80,000, all these institutions flooded in. The mega bulls on Bitcoin were predicting that the price would basically be $1 million right now with this endless BlackRock money coming in. I'm a huge Bitcoiner and will basically, hold on to it forever and pass it down to my kids, God willing. What do you think's going on with general sentiment with Bitcoin nowadays, in terms of, its relationship with global markets, what the US is doing? The president's been super pro Bitcoin. What's your read on what's going on with Bitcoin today?
Yeah. So Jordan, as a Bitcoiner, you've, I'm sure, lived through several Bitcoin winters by this point. And as far as crypto winners go, this one's relatively mild to crypto winners that we've seen in the past. Of course, Bitcoin's price is down significantly from last October, but we haven't seen the same kind of price dip that we've seen in past crypto winters. So I think that is actually a bullish indication that this is becoming a more mature asset that, yes, it's volatile, but it's remarkably less volatile than it's been in past cycles. And it's interesting too, because there's been a lot of quantum FUD out there. FUD, for the uninitiated, means fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It's an acronym. And what's fascinating to me, though, about the quantum FUD is that it has had zero impact whatsoever on the Bitcoin price. A perfect example of that is there was a paper published back in March from Google that showed that the amount of qubits it would require to break Bitcoin's cryptography is actually significantly lower, theoretically, than what they thought it would be in the past. What's fascinating about that, though, is ever since that paper was released, the price of Bitcoin has only been up. So it's almost as if the quantum FUD itself has already been priced in. I think as far as what we can expect next, there's usually a 4-year cycle with Bitcoin. I know that there are some believers in the 4-year cycle and some who don't believe in it. The truth is, this last cycle played out almost perfectly aligned with the idea of a 4-year cycle, where Bitcoin always needs to take some time to catch a breath. And I think that's what we're seeing take place right now. It's catching its breath. I think a lot of people are waiting to see what happens with Clarity too. The Clarity Act in Congress will likely be passed this summer, and that's very bullish for Bitcoin and the broader digital asset industry. We know that during the Biden years, a lot of Bitcoin developers came under siege. A lot of them fled the United States. During Trump 1, there were about 40% of digital asset developers based here in the United States. But during the Biden years, there was only 26%. In other words, the amount of developers building in this ecosystem about halved because of the regulatory persecution that took place during that time. But Clarity is about to pass, and Clarity will provide rules of the road for Bitcoiners and for everybody in the digital asset space. And to me, that's a remarkably bullish signal, because you look at how well Bitcoin performed when almost every major country and financial institution in the world was trying to ban it or get rid of it. It was the best performing asset of the last decade. So imagine how well it could perform once we have the imprimatur of the US government essentially saying that Bitcoin is a legitimate asset and you can hold it, and that's your right as an American citizen. I think that's a really bullish catalyst for Bitcoin. And we'll see what happens in the future, but it seems like we're in a catch your breath phase right now. And I'm bullish on what will take place in the next couple of years in the Bitcoin ecosystem.
Yeah, I for one can't wait to prove the haters wrong. I've been, time stamping a lot of the trash talk, and when Bitcoin inevitably hits an all-time high in the not so distant future, I will be the first person to bring it up again. But it's interesting that there's kind of the newest wave, I think, of Bitcoin adoption is having the hardest time of seeing the price action kind of like steadying around 80 for now, when they bought in at 40% higher. So it's kind of like a rite of passage at this point, that you need to like take some, you need to absorb some pain before reaping the benefits of having multiple X's next to your original holding number. It's amazing what like people like Michael Saylor have been doing for many years, and the persistence and the true belief based in math, basically, in the longevity and the reality of Bitcoin being perhaps like the currency, the global sovereign currency of I think the not so distant future again. So it'll be interesting to see. One last question. So on the public facing side, when you were a public servant in Treasury, what was kind of like sentiment, as much as you can share, behind the scenes on Bitcoin? Because like when you were there, it's really only been during Trump 2 that they really started to take a strong interest in Bitcoin policy. So I assume like you helped to kind of like shape some of like the original stuff on paper, talking about this multi-trillion-dollar asset and several trillion-dollar space. What was it like, kind of like shaping this policy?
It was surreal in a way, because before Trump 2, I was in the private sector making the case for Bitcoin before the American public, and just trying to defend its right to exist amidst the siege that was laid by the Biden administration. And then to be on the inside of government, helping shape policy messaging around the strategic Bitcoin reserve, was the culmination of many years of hard work on the part of the Bitcoin industry. And it was really rewarding to see how many Bitcoin aligned people work in the United States government. Bitcoiners in the previous administration probably were either very closeted or would have been driven out if they had been publicly identified as people who supported Bitcoin, because the last admin was so inimical to Bitcoin and everything that it stood for. So it made me really hopeful to see how many people working at Treasury and in other agencies liked Bitcoin, believed in its prospects as a potential global reserve asset, and we're working really hard to implement President Trump's vision of making the United States into a Bitcoin superpower. So it made me hopeful to see both Treasury and Commerce working on the strategic Bitcoin reserve and ironing out some of the wrinkles to get that made into a reality as well.
Yeah, I must say it's wildly impressive that someone like President Trump, who I think is 80 years old now, is so kind of like up to date with innovation and the technological themes of the day. He owns a ton of Bitcoin. I think that, if you look at these like public statements attached to his companies, the president's basically connected to, I think, well over $1 billion worth of Bitcoin, and very proud of it. The vice president owns Bitcoin. If you were to ask, like either of us, like 5, 6 years ago, if any of this would be happening, we would just be awestruck, I think, at the possibility of all these top officials so passionate about specifically Bitcoin. But, I'm glad to see that the president is really bullish on AI, understands the stakes with the China race. And again, Sam, like, really appreciate you coming on. Where can we find your work with Bitcoin policy and everything else you're doing?
Yeah, likewise, Jordan. Thanks for having me on. Our website is btcpolicy.org. So at btcpolicy.org, your listeners can see all of our research papers, including the paper on foreign influence in the campaign against American AI, as well as a lot of the work we've done on Bitcoin and the broader digital asset ecosystem.
All right, awesome. Well, thanks so much. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, Jordan.